Story number 1.
The first time Clara's parents noticed something strange about her, she was only 3 years old. They were in the kitchen, and Clara, who had been coloring on the living room floor, suddenly began speaking to someone who wasn't there. Her words were babyish, almost unintelligible, but the intensity in her small face was impossible to miss. She giggled, pointed, and even paused as though listening to a reply. "Who are you talking to, sweetheart?" Her mother, Evelyn, asked nervously. Clara turned, her expression calm but matter-of-fact. "The man by the window. He says he's cold." Evelyn froze, her eyes darting toward the window. It was empty, of course, just the pale afternoon light filtering through the curtains. Clara's father, Mark, brushed it off as the overactive imagination of a child, but Evelyn couldn't shake the unease. Over time, it became clear that Clara wasn't like other children. By the time she was 6, Clara could describe people she'd never met, relatives who had died long before she was born. She'd casually mention details about them that no one had ever told her. When asked how she knew, she'd shrug and say, "They told me." At first, her parents tried to ignore it. Evelyn rationalized it as coincidence, and Mark tried to laugh it off. But Clara's friends became harder to dismiss. Shadows seemed to linger longer in her room than they should. The family cat, Buttons, avoided her like the plague, hissing and arching its back whenever Clara came near. One night, Evelyn woke to the sound of Clara crying. Rushing to her daughter's room, she found Clara sitting upright in bed, tears streaming down her face. "What's wrong, baby?" Evelyn asked, pulling Clara into her arms. "The lady won't stop yelling," Clara whispered. Evelyn's blood turned cold. "What lady?" Clara pointed to the corner of the room, by where nothing but a stuffed bear sat slumped against the wall. "She's mad. She says I'm not supposed to be here." Evelyn turned on every light in the room, her heart pounding. She stayed with Clara the rest of the night, but she could swear she felt the air in the room grow colder. The incidents escalated as Clara got older. By the time she was 10, she could predict things before they happened. She told her teacher not to drive home one afternoon because of a black car, and later that evening, the teacher was involved in a near-fatal crash caused by a speeding black SUV. She would sometimes stare at strangers in public, her eyes wide with fear, and later confess that she'd seen dark things following them. But it wasn't until Clara's 13th birthday that the full extent of her power revealed itself. The family had moved to an old farmhouse in rural Vermont, hoping the change of scenery would give Clara some peace. The house was isolated, surrounded by dense woods, and had a history the realtor had been hesitant to disclose. Mark brushed it off as small-town superstition, but Evelyn had felt uneasy from the moment they stepped inside. Clara seemed drawn to the house immediately. "It's loud here," she said during their first visit. "What do you mean, loud?" Evelyn asked. Clara tilted her head as though listening to something distant. "They're all talking at once." Evelyn didn't press her. She didn't want to know. For the first few weeks, things were quiet. Clara seemed almost happy, spending her days exploring the woods and sketching strange symbols in her notebook. But then, the scratching started. At first, it was faint, like the sound of tree branches brushing against the windows, but it grew louder, more insistent. It came from inside the walls, echoing through the house at odd hours. Mark tore apart sections of drywall, convinced they had rats, but he found nothing. One night, Evelyn woke to the sound of whispers. She shook Mark awake, but he dismissed it as the wind. Then they heard it again, a low, guttural murmuring that seemed to seep through the walls. They followed the sound to Clara's room. She was standing in the middle of the room, her arms outstretched, her head tilted back. The air around her shimmered like heat waves, and her voice, low and guttural, not her own, filled the room. "Clara!" Evelyn screamed, rushing toward her. The moment she touched her daughter, the temperature plummeted. Frost formed on the windows, and Clara collapsed into her mother's arms, unconscious. When Clara woke, she had no memory of what had happened. But after that night, the house felt different. The air was heavier, oppressive. Shadows seemed to pool in corners and stretch across the floor. The scratching in the walls became a nightly torment, and faint, echoing footsteps could be heard on the stairs. Clara became withdrawn, pale, and exhausted. She confessed to Evelyn that the voices were getting louder, angrier. "They don't like me," she said one night, her voice trembling. "They say I'm too strong. Evelyn didn't know what to do. They brought in a priest, but the moment he stepped into the house, Clara screamed. She clutched her head, crying out in pain, until the priest left. The final straw came one stormy night in late November. The power had gone out, and the family huddled together in the living room, candles casting flickering shadows on the walls. Clara was unusually quiet, staring into the flame of a candle as though entranced. Suddenly, the room grew icy cold. The flames of the candles flickered and died, plunging them into darkness. Mark reached for a flashlight, but before he could turn it on, a deafening crash echoed through the house. Clara stood, her eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. "They're coming," she said in a voice that wasn't hers. Evelyn grabbed her daughter, shaking her. "Clara, stop this!" Clara's head snapped toward her, her expression eerily calm. "I can't stop it. They want you to leave." The room erupted in chaos. Furniture toppled over, glass shattered, and the walls seemed to pulse with a dark, malevolent energy. Mark tried to drag Evelyn and Clara toward the door, but it was as though an invisible force held them in place. Clara raised her hands, and the chaos stopped. The house fell silent, the air heavy with the smell of ozone. "They're gone," she said quietly, her voice her own again. What just happened?" Mark stammered, his face pale. "They won't bother you anymore," Clara said, her eyes filling with tears. "But I can't stay here. They're afraid of me. I make them angry." Evelyn sobbed, clutching her daughter. "You're not going anywhere. We'll figure this out." But Clara shook her head. "I don't belong here, Mom. I'm different." The next morning, Clara was gone. Evelyn and Mark searched everywhere, but it was as though she had vanished into thin air. The police found no trace of her, and no one in the nearby towns had seen her. Months passed, then years, but Clara never returned. Evelyn refused to move, clinging to the hope that her daughter would one day come back. And though the house was quiet now, she sometimes thought she could hear faint whispers in the dead of night, whispers that sounded like Clara's voice calling from somewhere just out of reach. Story the end.
Story number 2.
The first time Olivia sensed something strange about herself, she was 6 years old. Her family had just moved into a large, century-old house in a quiet New England town. It was a beautiful home, but the locals whispered about its history, a place with a past. Her parents didn't believe in superstitions, shrugging off the house's reputation as haunted nonsense. But Olivia couldn't ignore what she felt the moment they walked inside. The air in the house felt heavy, like something unseen was pressing down on her chest. Shadows lingered a little too long in the corners, and every so often, Olivia swore she could hear faint whispers, though no one else seemed to notice. She didn't tell her parents. She didn't think they'd believe her. Then, one evening, Olivia was playing with her dolls in her room when she felt it for the first time. A sudden, sharp chill in the air, followed by an overwhelming sense of being watched. She turned her head slowly and froze. There, by the window, stood a woman. The figure was pale and transparent, her hair flowing as though caught in a gentle breeze. Her eyes locked onto Olivia's, and for a moment neither moved. Then, as quickly as she had appeared, the woman was gone. Olivia didn't scream. She didn't run. She just sat there, clutching her doll, her heart pounding. She told herself it was her imagination, but deep down, she knew it wasn't. Over the next few months, more strange things began to happen. Objects moved on their own, books sliding off shelves, doors creaking open and shut without a breeze. The whispers grew louder, though Olivia still couldn't make out the words. And then there were the dreams. Night after night, Olivia dreamed of the woman by the window. Sometimes she was crying, sometimes she was screaming, and sometimes she simply stood there staring. But one dream stood out above the rest. In it, the woman reached out to Olivia and spoke 3 words. "Help me, please." When Olivia woke, she knew it wasn't just a dream. The woman needed her. At first, Olivia tried to ignore it. She didn't want to be the girl who talked to ghosts, but the more she ignored the woman, the more insistent the haunting became. Lights flickered, the whispers turned to sobs, and Olivia began to feel a cold hand brush against her skin at night. Finally, she couldn't take it anymore. One afternoon, while her parents were out, Olivia sat cross-legged on her bedroom floor and whispered into the empty air, "What do you want?" For a moment, there was silence. Then the temperature in the room dropped, and the woman appeared again, her form more solid than before. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Olivia strained to understand, but the woman faded before she could. Frustrated but determined, Olivia decided to learn more about the house. She borrowed old newspapers from the local library and scoured them for anything about the property. What she found made her blood run cold. The house had once belonged to a family named the Remingtons. In 1922, tragedy struck when the mother, Eleanor, was found dead at the bottom of the grand staircase. The death was ruled an accident, but rumors swirled about foul play. Some said her husband had pushed her in a fit of rage. Others whispered of a darker, supernatural force. Olivia knew the woman in her dreams had to be Eleanor. But why was she still here? That night, Olivia lay awake, staring at the ceiling, when the whispering began again. This time, it was clearer. "Find the truth," the voice said. The next day, Olivia went back to the library, combing through more records. She found an old photograph of the Remington family and immediately recognized Eleanor as the woman she'd been seeing. But something about the photo struck her as odd. Eleanor's eyes looked haunted, desperate. Olivia couldn't shake the feeling that the truth about Eleanor's death wasn't in the newspapers. It was in the house. Determined to help, Olivia began exploring the house late at night when her parents were asleep. She felt drawn to the attic, a place her mother called off-limits because of its creaky floorboards and endless dust. One night, clutching a flashlight, Olivia crept up the narrow staircase to the attic. The air was thick and suffocating, and every step she took seemed louder than the last. As she scanned the room, her light fell on an old, locked trunk in the corner. Her heart raced as she approached it. The key was nowhere to be found, but something told her she needed to see what was inside. Over the next few days, Olivia searched the house for the key, guided by an almost supernatural sense of where to look. Finally, she found it hidden behind a loose brick in the fireplace. That night, she returned to the attic and unlocked the trunk. Inside were letters, diaries, and photographs, pieces of Eleanor's life. As Olivia read through the letters, a chilling story unfolded. Eleanor had been trapped in an abusive marriage, her husband controlling and cruel. In her diary, she wrote about feeling watched, haunted by a dark presence in the house that seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. But the most shocking entry was the last one, dated the night before her death. "He's coming for me. I hear the whispers. If anyone finds this, know that I didn't fall. He pushed me." Olivia's hands trembled as she closed the diary. Eleanor hadn't died by accident. She had been murdered. Armed with the truth, Olivia felt a newfound sense of purpose. That night, she lit a candle in her room and called out to Eleanor. "I know what happened to you," she said. "I'll help you find peace." Eleanor appeared, her form clearer than ever. For the first time, Olivia could see the tears streaming down her face. The room filled with a heavy, suffocating energy, and the whispers grew louder, almost deafening. Then, the door to Olivia's room slammed shut. The temperature dropped, and the shadows in the room began to move, coalescing into a dark, hulking figure. Olivia's heart pounded as the figure advanced toward her, its presence radiating pure malice. But she didn't back down. She clutched the diary in her hands and shouted, "You can't hurt her anymore! You can't hurt me!" The figure stopped, its form flickering like a dying flame. Olivia felt a surge of energy she couldn't explain, like an invisible force coursing through her veins. She raised her hand, and the dark figure recoiled, letting out a guttural scream before vanishing into nothingness. When Olivia turned, Eleanor was still there, but her expression had changed. She looked at peace, the room filled with a soft, warm light, and for the first time, Eleanor spoke aloud. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft but steady, and then she was gone. From that night on, the house was quiet. The whispers stopped, and the air no longer felt heavy. Olivia never saw Eleanor again, but she felt her presence sometimes, a comforting warmth that let her know she had done the right thing. Her parents never knew the full story, though they noticed the change in Olivia. She was stronger now, more confident, and her fear had been replaced with a quiet determination. Olivia knew she had a gift, one that came with great responsibility, and though she didn't fully understand it yet, she was ready to face whatever came next. Story the end.
Story number 3.
The first time anyone noticed something different about Lily, she was just 4 years old. Her family lived in a modest house on the outskirts of a small, sleepy town. It was the kind of place where neighbors knew each other's business, where whispers of superstition and folklore ran deep. Lily's parents dismissed the local stories, tales of spirits and curses, as harmless nonsense. But Lily was the kind of child who seemed to see things others didn't. One summer evening, as the family sat in the backyard enjoying the cool twilight air, Lily suddenly stood up from her spot on the grass and pointed toward the edge of the woods. "Who's that man?" she asked. Her parents exchanged a confused glance. There was no one there. "What man, sweetie?" her mother, Karen, asked. Lily frowned, tilting her head as if listening to something only she could hear. "The one with the black coat. He's watching us." Karen laughed nervously, brushing it off as her daughter's active imagination. But Lily's father, Tom, felt a chill run down his spine. That night, as they tucked Lily into bed, he asked her again about the man she'd seen. "He doesn't like you," Lily said matter-of-factly. "He says you took something from him." Tom didn't sleep well that night. As Lily grew older, the strange occurrences became harder to ignore. Lights flickered whenever she was upset, and she seemed to know things before they happened. Once, she told her mother to be careful driving to the grocery store because the blue car is going to hit you. Karen had laughed it off, but later that day, a blue car ran a red light at an intersection, missing her by inches. But the real turning point came when Lily was 10. The family had just moved into an old Victorian house closer to the center of town. It was a beautiful home, but it carried an unsettling atmosphere that Karen couldn't quite explain. She chalked it up to the creaks and groans of an aging house, but Lily felt it the moment they stepped inside. "They're here," Lily said quietly. "Who's here?" Karen asked, kneeling down to look her daughter in the eye. "The people who don't want us to stay." Karen shivered but forced a smile. "Don't be silly, sweetheart. It's just a house." But Lily wasn't being silly. Over the next few weeks, the house came alive with strange activity. Doors slammed on their own, as faint whispers echoed through the hallways at night, and the family dog, Max, refused to go upstairs. Karen tried to ignore it, but Tom became increasingly irritable, snapping at shadows and brushing off cold drafts that seemed to follow him everywhere. One night, Lily woke up screaming. Karen rushed to her room and found her daughter huddled under the covers, trembling. "What's wrong, baby?" Karen asked, pulling her into her arms. Lily's voice was barely a whisper. "She's angry. She says I'm too strong." "Who says that?" Karen asked, her heart racing. Lily pointed to the corner of the room where the shadows seemed darker, thicker. The lady with the burned face. Karen felt her blood run cold. She turned on every light in the room, but there was nothing there. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was watching them. The next day, Karen decided to dig into the history of the house. She visited the local library and found an old newspaper article about a fire that had destroyed part of the house in 1918. A woman named Margaret Gray had died in the blaze, her body found in what was now Lily's bedroom. Some said it was an accident, but others believed Margaret had been trapped intentionally. Her husband had vanished shortly after the fire, and rumors of foul play had swirled for years. Karen felt a knot form in her stomach. She knew better than to tell Lily about what she'd found, but when she returned home, Lily was waiting for her at the kitchen table. "Her name is Margaret," Lily said without prompting. "She's mad because she can't leave." Karen stared at her daughter, unable to speak. Lily looked down at her hands, twisting her fingers nervously. "She says I can help her, but the man doesn't want me to." "What man?" Karen whispered. "The one with the black coat," Lily replied. "He's keeping her here." Karen felt a wave of nausea. The man with the black coat. The same figure Lily had mentioned all those years ago in their old backyard. How could that be possible? That night, Karen and Tom argued. He refused to believe any of it, calling it nonsense and saying Lily was just a child with an overactive imagination. But as the days passed, even Tom couldn't deny the escalating activity in the house. Objects flew off shelves, footsteps echoed in the empty hallways, and Lily began waking up with bruises on her arms. Finally, in desperation, Karen reached out to a local medium, an older woman named Abigail, who had a reputation for helping families with unexplained phenomena. When Abigail arrived, she took one look at Lily and gasped. "She's a beacon," Abigail said. "Spirits are drawn to her. She has a power that most people can't even begin to understand." "What does that mean?" Karen asked, her voice trembling. "It means she's the key," Abigail replied, "but it also means she's in danger." That night, Abigail conducted a seance in the living room with Karen, Tom, and Lily sitting in a circle around the table. The air grew heavy, and the candles flickered as Abigail called out to the spirits in the house. "Margaret, if you're here, show yourself," Abigail said. The temperature plummeted, and the faint outline of a woman appeared at the edge of the room. Her face was disfigured, the skin charred and blistered, but her eyes were filled with pain and desperation. "Help me," Margaret whispered. Before anyone could respond, the room erupted in chaos. A deafening roar filled the air as the dark figure of a man materialized in the corner, his black coat billowing as though caught in a storm. He lunged toward Margaret, his form radiating hatred and rage. "No!" Lily screamed, standing up and raising her hands. A blinding light erupted from Lily's body, forcing everyone to shield their eyes. When the light faded, the man was gone, and Margaret stood in the center of the room, her form clearer and brighter than before. "Thank you," she said, her voice filled with gratitude. "I'm free." And then she vanished. The house was silent after that. The oppressive energy was gone, replaced by a sense of peace. Abigail explained that Lily's power had banished the dark spirit, allowing Margaret to move on. But she also warned that this wouldn't be the last time Lily encountered spirits. "You have a gift," Abigail told her, "and with that gift comes responsibility. You'll face more of them, some good, some bad, but never doubt your strength." Lily nodded, her young face filled with determination. She didn't fully understand her power yet, but she knew one thing for certain: she wasn't afraid anymore.
Story number 4.
The night it all began, Emma sat alone in the family living room, a book balanced on her knees, and the soft hum of rain against the window pane filling the silence. She had always been a quiet child, a dreamer with a tendency to drift into her own world. At 14, she had started to notice the way people often looked at her, sometimes with curiosity, sometimes with unease. It wasn't her fault, of course. Strange things had a way of happening when she was around. She remembered the first time she'd felt it. She was 6, playing in the backyard of their old home when she saw a boy about her age sitting under the oak tree. He had pale skin and wide, sad eyes, and he stared at her as if waiting for something. She'd walked up to him and asked his name, but he only shook his head. Moments later, her mother called her inside, and when she turned back to the boy, he was gone. Her parents said it was her imagination, but deep down, Emma knew better. The boy had been real, or at least he had been real in some way she didn't fully understand. Now, 8 years later, in a new house miles away, Emma felt that same unease creeping over her. It wasn't the house itself. Her family's farmhouse was warm and inviting, though old. It was something else, something lingering just out of sight, just beyond the edges of her senses. The first sign came late one night when Emma was lying in bed, her room illuminated only by the faint glow of moonlight through the curtains. She'd been drifting off to sleep when she felt it, a hand brushing lightly against her ankle. Her eyes snapped open, and she bolted upright, scanning the room. No one was there. She told herself it was a dream, but the feeling lingered, making it impossible to fall back asleep. The next morning, she mentioned it casually to her mother, who dismissed it as a product of overactive imagination and too many ghost stories. But Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That evening, as the family sat down to dinner, Emma felt it again. A chill swept through the room, sharp and sudden despite the roaring fire in the hearth. Her younger brother Ben paused mid-bite and looked at her. "Did you feel that?" he asked. Their parents exchanged uneasy glances, but neither said anything. That night, as Emma lay in bed, the air around her grew heavy. It pressed down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. She tried to move, but her body felt paralyzed, frozen in place. And then she saw her, a woman standing in the corner of the room, her face obscured by a curtain of long, dark hair. Emma wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The woman moved closer, her movements slow and deliberate until she stood at the foot of Emma's bed. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Help me." And just like that, the weight lifted. Emma sat up, gasping for air, and the woman was gone. The next morning, Emma didn't tell her family. She wasn't sure they'd believe her, and even if they did, what could they do? Instead, she started digging. She went to the local library and searched for anything she could find about their farmhouse. It didn't take long to find the story. The house had belonged to a family named the Arlingtons in the late 1800s. The youngest daughter, Sarah, had disappeared one winter night and was never found. Rumors swirled about what had happened to her. Some said she'd run away, others believed she'd been murdered, but no one knew the truth. Emma felt a chill as she read the old newspaper clippings. The woman she'd seen in her room couldn't have been Sarah. She was far too old. But something about the story felt connected, as if Sarah's disappearance had left a mark on the house. That night, Emma decided to confront whatever was haunting her. She lit a candle in her room and sat cross-legged on the floor, her heart pounding. "I know you're here," she said aloud, her voice trembling. "What do you want?" For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the candle flickered, and the temperature in the room plummeted. Emma shivered as the woman appeared again, and for space, standing by the window this time. Her face was pale and gaunt, her eyes hollow with sorrow. "Help me," she said again, her voice echoing as though it came from far away. Emma swallowed hard. "How? What do you need me to do?" The woman raised a trembling hand and pointed to the floor. Emma followed her gaze and realized she was pointing to the corner of the room where the floorboards looked slightly warped. The next morning, armed with a crowbar and Ben's help, Emma pried up the floorboards. Beneath them, they found an old, rusted box. Inside were yellowed letters, a locket, and a small, leather-bound journal. Emma opened the journal, her hands shaking, and began to read. The entries were written in a neat, flowing script that belonged to Sarah Arlington. The final entry made Emma's breath catch in her throat. "I know she's coming for me. Mother says I imagine things, but I hear her at night, whispering my name. She says she needs me, but I'm afraid. I don't think she means well." Emma realized then that Sarah hadn't disappeared. She'd been taken by the same woman who now haunted the house. That night, Emma called to the spirit again, this time clutching Sarah's journal in her hands. The woman appeared, her form more solid than before. "You took her," Emma said, her voice firm. "You took Sarah. Why?" The woman's face twisted with anguish. "I didn't mean to. I was lost, and she could see me. I needed her to help me, but I held on too tight. I didn't know how to let go." Emma felt a wave of sorrow wash over her. The spirit wasn't evil. She was desperate. "You have to let go now," Emma said softly. "You're hurting her. You're hurting yourself. It's time to move on." The woman hesitated, her form flickering. Then slowly she nodded. The room filled with a soft, warm light, and the spirit began to fade. For the first time, her face looked peaceful. "Thank you," she whispered before disappearing entirely. The house felt different after that, lighter, quieter. Emma knew the spirit was gone, but she also knew her connection to the unseen world wasn't. She didn't fully understand her gift, but she was determined to use it to help, and she wasn't afraid anymore.
Story number 5.
The McAllister family had lived on Pine Hill Road for generations. Their home, a weathered farmhouse, sat on the edge of a dense forest that locals avoided after dark. Stories of strange figures moving among the trees and whispers that carried on the wind had circulated for decades. When the latest generation of McAllisters, Grace and her 12-year-old daughter Ellie, moved back into the house after Grace's divorce, they hoped for a fresh start. What they found was far from it. Ellie had always been different. From the time she could talk, she had a way of knowing things she shouldn't. When her grandmother fell ill, Ellie said, "She'll be okay in the morning." And she was. When her father lost his job, Ellie told him, "You'll find something better next week." And he did. Grace often dismissed it as coincidence, though a part of her felt uneasy about her daughter's uncanny sense of the world. The first few weeks in the old farmhouse were uneventful. Ellie spent her days exploring the surrounding woods, picking wildflowers, and sketching the landscape in her notebook. Grace, busy with unpacking and settling in, didn't notice the subtle changes in her daughter at first. It began with Ellie talking to someone who wasn't there. One evening, Grace found her sitting in the living room, staring at the empty armchair by the fireplace. Ellie's lips moved as if she were in conversation, though no sound came out. When Grace asked her who she was talking to, Ellie smiled and said, "The lady in the blue dress? She's sad because she lost her son." Grace froze. The armchair had belonged to Grace's great-grandmother, who had famously worn a blue dress on the day she received the news of her son's death in a hunting accident. But Ellie couldn't possibly know that. It's just her imagination, Grace told herself. But the unease lingered. That night, Grace woke to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. She got up, thinking Ellie was wandering the house, but when she checked her daughter's room, Ellie was fast asleep. The footsteps continued, moving from the hallway to the stairs. Grace's heart pounded as she followed the sound, clutching a flashlight. When she reached the bottom of the stairs, the living room was freezing cold. The armchair by the fireplace rocked gently, as if someone had just risen from it. Grace backed away, her breath visible in the frigid air. The next morning, she asked Ellie if she had noticed anything strange. Ellie nodded, her expression serious. "They don't want us here," she said. "Who doesn't?" Grace asked, trying to keep her voice calm. Ellie tilted her head as if listening to something only she could hear. "The ones who stayed behind." Grace decided it was time to learn more about the house's history. She visited the local library and dug through old records. What she discovered made her stomach churn. In the late 1800s, a family named the Harpers had lived in the farmhouse. After a particularly harsh winter, the entire family had vanished without a trace. Some said they'd moved west in search of better opportunities, but others believed they had met a more sinister fate. When Grace returned home, Ellie was waiting for her at the kitchen table, her face pale. "They're in the woods," Ellie said. "That's where they went." Grace felt a chill run down her spine. "What do you mean?" Ellie looked up at her, her dark eyes unblinking. "They're buried there. All of them. But they don't want to be." Grace tried to brush off her daughter's words, but the thought gnawed at her. Over the next few nights, the disturbances in the house grew worse. Objects moved on their own, faint whispers echoed through the hallways, and the temperature dropped sharply in certain rooms. One night, Ellie woke screaming. Grace rushed to her room to find her daughter sitting upright in bed, tears streaming down her face. "She's angry," Ellie sobbed. "She wants to leave, but she can't. He won't let her." "Who won't let her?" Grace asked, her voice trembling. Ellie pointed toward the corner of the room, where shadows seemed to gather unnaturally. "The man. He says it's his house. He says no one can leave." Grace felt a wave of fear she hadn't known was possible. She decided to call a local priest, Father Donovan, who had a reputation for dealing with the unexplainable. When he arrived, the house was deathly quiet, as if holding its breath. Father Donovan walked through the rooms, his expression growing graver with each step. "There's something here," he finally said. "Something old, and it's tied to the land." That evening, Father Donovan led Grace and Ellie in a prayer, asking for peace and protection. As they prayed, Ellie's body stiffened. Her eyes rolled back, and she began to speak in a voice that wasn't her own. "You don't belong here," the voice growled. "This is my place." Grace watched in horror as her daughter's small frame trembled under the weight of whatever had taken hold of her. Father Donovan stood firm, reciting verses from the Bible, his voice unwavering. "Release her," he commanded. "You have no power here." Ellie let out a guttural scream, and then the room fell silent. She collapsed into her mother's arms, her body limp but unharmed. "It's not over," Father Donovan warned. "Whatever is here, it's deeply rooted. It will take more than a prayer to drive it away." That night, Ellie told her mother everything. She had seen the Harper family, mother, father, and 3 children, wandering the woods, their faces etched with despair. The mother, the woman in the blue dress, had begged Ellie to help them. She said they were trapped by the man who had taken their lives. "He won't let them go," Ellie whispered, "but I think I can." The next morning, Ellie led Grace and Father Donovan into the woods. They walked in silence until Ellie stopped abruptly, pointing to a patch of earth beneath a towering oak tree. "They're here," she said. Father Donovan began to dig, and Grace helped, her hands trembling. After hours of work, they unearthed bones, old, brittle, but unmistakably human. Grace felt bile rise in her throat as she realized the truth. The Harper family hadn't disappeared. They'd been murdered and buried here. As they stood over the makeshift grave, Ellie knelt down and placed her hands on the earth. She closed her eyes, and a soft glow seemed to emanate from her. The air grew warm, and for a moment the forest was silent. When Ellie opened her eyes, she smiled faintly. "They're free now." Grace wanted to believe it was over, but deep down, She knew Ellie's gift would always draw the unseen to her. Still, as they walked back to the house, the oppressive weight that had hung over the property was gone. The house felt lighter, brighter, as if the darkness had been lifted. Ellie never spoke of the Harpers again, but Grace noticed the way she seemed calmer, more at peace. The whispers in the hallways ceased, the footsteps in the night faded, and the armchair by the fireplace remained still. For the first time in a long while, the McAllister house felt like home again.
Story number 6.
The Wilsons moved to the quiet town of Everbrook after Emily, their 11-year-old daughter, began experiencing what they called episodes. Doctors couldn't explain her strange behaviors, whispers to unseen companions, sudden bursts of knowledge about people she had never met, and vivid dreams of places she'd never been. It's just her imagination, they told themselves, but deep down, they knew there was more to it. Their new house sat at the end of a lonely dirt road, bordered by an overgrown field on one side and dense woods on the other. It had stood vacant for years, its previous owners having abandoned it under mysterious circumstances. Emily was the first to notice something odd about the place. On their first night in the house, as her parents unpacked boxes in the kitchen, Emily wandered into the living room. The air felt heavy there, thick with something she couldn't name. The large, ornate mirror above the fireplace caught her attention. Its surface was smudged and the frame's gold leaf was tarnished. She moved closer and saw something unusual, a faint outline of a boy standing behind her. She spun around, but no one was there. When she told her parents about it, they brushed it off. Just a reflection, her father said, though Emily knew better. The strange occurrences started small. Lights flickered, the old floorboards creaked under invisible weight, and sometimes faint whispers floated through the house at night. Emily wasn't afraid. She felt drawn to the unseen presence. One night she woke to the sound of tapping on her bedroom window. She sat up, heart racing, and saw a boy about her age standing outside. His face was pale, almost luminous in the moonlight, and his eyes held a sadness that tugged at her heart. "Who are you?" she whispered, but the boy vanished before her eyes. The next day, she explored the woods behind the house, searching for any trace of the boy. As she walked deeper into the trees, she felt a strange pull, as though something was guiding her. She came upon a small clearing where the ground was uneven, the soil darker than the rest of the forest floor. That night, she dreamed of the boy again. This time, he spoke. "My name is Jacob," he said, his voice soft but urgent. "Please help me." When Emily told her parents about the dream, they grew uneasy. They didn't believe in ghosts, but they couldn't deny the changes in their daughter. She seemed distant, distracted, as if she were carrying a heavy burden. Emily began spending more time in the woods, drawn back to the clearing again and again. She brought a notebook and sketched what she saw in her dreams. Jacob's face, the clearing, and something else. A large, gnarled tree with strange markings carved into its trunk. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Emily stood in the clearing, staring at the tree from her dreams. She felt a cold breeze brush past her, and then she heard it, a faint, echoing voice. "Emily?" She turned, but no one was there. That night, Emily asked her parents about the house's history. Reluctantly, her mother admitted that they had bought it at a steep discount because of its reputation. "There were rumors," she said, "about a boy who disappeared years ago. His family lived here before us." Emily's father dismissed it. "It's just a story," he said, but Emily wasn't so sure. The following day, Emily went to the local library and searched for anything she could find about the house and its former residents. She found an old newspaper article about Jacob Miller, a boy who had vanished from the property 50 years earlier. His body was never found, and his family moved away soon after. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that Jacob was still there, trapped somehow, and that he was trying to reach her. She returned to the clearing and stood before the gnarled tree. Placing her hands on its rough bark, she closed her eyes and whispered, "I'm here. Tell me what to do." The ground beneath her feet grew cold, and the air filled with the faint scent of smoke. Images flooded her mind. Flashes of a small boy running through the woods, a man chasing him, and a struggle near the tree. Then, darkness. When she opened her eyes, she knew what she had to do. She ran home and told her parents everything. Though they were skeptical, her mother agreed to call the local police. When the officers arrived, Emily led them to the tree and pointed to the darkened soil. "They're here," she said simply. The officers hesitated, but eventually began digging. Hours later, they unearthed bones, a small skeleton buried beneath the roots of the tree. The discovery shocked the community, and DNA testing confirmed it was Jacob Miller. As the remains were taken away, Emily felt a wave of relief. That night, she dreamed of Jacob one last time. He stood in the clearing, his face no longer sad but peaceful. "Thank you," he said before fading into the light. After that, the house grew quiet. The whispers stopped, the air felt lighter, and the mirror above the fireplace reflected nothing but their own faces. Emily knew Jacob was finally at rest, and though she didn't fully understand her gift, she realized it was her responsibility to help those who couldn't help themselves. Her parents never spoke of the events again, but Emily couldn't forget. She knew there were others out there, lost and waiting for someone like her to set them free.
Story number 7.
When the Lanes moved into the old Victorian house on the outskirts of Brookville, they saw it as a chance for a new beginning. The house had a history. Anyone in town could tell you that, but the family didn't care about ghost stories. To them, it was just a sprawling, affordable home with creaky floorboards and peeling wallpaper. From the moment 13-year-old Sophie stepped inside, she felt it. A strange pressure in the air, like walking into a room where someone had just been arguing. She didn't say anything to her parents. They had enough on their minds with unpacking and settling into their new lives after the divorce. It started the first night. Sophie woke to the sound of faint humming, a gentle, lilting tune that seemed to float through the walls. She got up, her bare feet cold against the wooden floor, and followed the sound down the hall. It led her to a small, locked door at the end of the corridor, one she hadn't noticed before. The humming stopped as soon as she reached it. When she mentioned it the next morning, her mother waved it off. "It's an old house, sweetie. Old houses make noises." Sophie wasn't convinced. The second night, she dreamed of a girl about her age, standing in the garden behind the house. The girl wore a faded white dress, her hair tied back with a ribbon, and her eyes were dark and hollow. She pointed at Sophie, her lips moving soundlessly before vanishing into the shadow of the house. The dream left Sophie shaken, but she didn't tell her parents. Instead, she started exploring the house, drawn to its secrets. She spent hours in the attic, where dust-covered trunks held brittle letters and forgotten photographs. She scoured the basement, where she found broken toys and a rocking horse that creaked with the slightest touch. Then, there was the locked door. It seemed to call to her, even in her sleep. One afternoon, Sophie found an old iron key, buried in the dirt near the garden. Her heart raced as she ran upstairs and fit it into the lock. It turned with a loud click, and the door creaked open to reveal a small, windowless room. Inside was a single chair facing the far wall, and faint marks scratched into the floor as though it had been dragged there again and again. Sophie's stomach churned. That night, the dreams became more vivid. The girl appeared again, standing in the room behind the locked door. This time, Sophie could hear her voice, faint and broken. "Help me." Sophie woke gasping for air, her chest tight with fear. She couldn't ignore it anymore. The next day, she went to the library and searched for any information she could find about the house. What she discovered sent chills down her spine. In the 1920s, the house had belonged to the Aldridge family. Their youngest daughter, Clara, had died tragically under mysterious circumstances. Some said she fell down the stairs, others whispered about an illness, but Sophie found an old newspaper article suggesting something far darker. Clara had been locked in a room for weeks before her death. The article mentioned no suspects, but Sophie knew there had to be more to the story. She returned home and began piecing together the fragments of Clara's life. The dreams, the locked door, the faint humming. Clara was trying to tell her something. That evening, as her parents watched TV downstairs, Sophie went back to the small room. She stood in the doorway, clutching a flashlight, and whispered, "Clara, are you here?" The air grew cold, and the flashlight flickered. Sophie's breath caught in her throat as a faint outline began to form in the corner. Clara stood there, her eyes filled with sorrow, her mouth trembling as though she wanted to speak. "What do you want?" Sophie asked, her voice barely audible. Clara pointed to the floor beneath the chair. Sophie hesitated, her heart pounding, before kneeling and pressing her hands against the wooden planks. They felt loose. She ran to grab a screwdriver and pried them up, revealing a small compartment. Inside was a tarnished locket and a stack of letters, tied with a ribbon. The letters were written in a shaky hand, their contents haunting. They were from Clara to her older brother, begging him to help her, to let her out of the room where their father had locked her after she tried to run away. The last letter ended abruptly, its ink smeared with what looked like tears. Sophie felt a wave of anger and grief wash over her. Clara had been trapped, punished for something she hadn't done, and forgotten by the world. She took the locket and the letters to the garden where Clara had first appeared in her dreams. Kneeling in the soft earth, she whispered, "I'm sorry, Clara. You didn't deserve this." The air around her grew warm, and for a moment she felt a gentle hand on her shoulder. When she looked up, Clara was standing there, her face no longer filled with sorrow, but with peace. "Thank you," Clara whispered before fading into the light. From that night on, the house felt different. The oppressive heaviness was gone, replaced by a quiet stillness. Sophie knew Clara had finally found rest, but she also knew her connection to the unseen world wasn't over. She could feel them now, the whispers of others who had been forgotten, waiting for someone to hear their stories, and Sophie knew she would listen. Story the end.
Story number 8.
The night Ellie Winters moved into the farmhouse with her family, the wind howled through the surrounding fields like a restless spirit. The house, perched at the edge of the town of Havenbrook, had been empty for nearly a decade. Locals called it the Crayford House, and anyone who had lived in Havenbrook long enough knew better than to speak of it openly. Ellie was only 12, and though she was quiet and unassuming, there was something about her that made people pause. She had an air of knowing about her, something unsettling. Her parents thought moving to the countryside would help her find peace, away from the city noise and the strange occurrences that seemed to follow her wherever she went. The first week was uneventful. Ellie spent her days wandering the sprawling property, sketching wildflowers and studying the old house's peculiar details. The faded wallpaper, the heavy iron fixtures, and the crooked staircase that led to a dusty attic. It was there on the second day that she found the doll. It sat in a wooden rocking chair, its porcelain face cracked and its dress yellowed with age. Ellie felt an immediate pull toward it, though she couldn't explain why. She brought it downstairs despite her mother's protests. That night, Ellie had the first dream. She saw a young girl, no older than herself, standing in a field. Her hair was dark and matted, and her dress was torn. The girl's lips moved, but no sound came out. Behind her loomed the house, its windows like dark eyes staring out at the world. The girl lifted a trembling hand and pointed toward the barn. Ellie woke with a start, the room cold despite the warm summer night. The next morning, she walked to the barn. The structure was weathered and leaning, its roof sagging under years of neglect. As she stepped inside, a sudden chill swept over her. Dust motes hung suspended in the shafts of sunlight filtering through the cracks in the wooden walls. Something was there. She could feel it. Near the back of the barn, Ellie noticed a patch of earth that seemed disturbed. The ground was slightly sunken, as though it had been dug up and poorly replaced. She knelt and pressed her hand to the soil. A flood of images filled her mind. A man with cruel eyes, a girl screaming, and the swing of a heavy shovel. Ellie pulled her hand back, trembling. She didn't tell her parents what she'd seen. They wouldn't believe her. They never had before. The nights that followed grew more intense. The dreams returned, each one more vivid than the last. The girl in the dreams, whom Ellie now called Sarah, seemed desperate to communicate something. Ellie began hearing whispers during the day, faint and fleeting, just at the edge of her hearing. One evening, as Ellie sat sketching on the porch, the whispers grew louder. She looked up and saw Sarah standing at the edge of the woods. For the first time, she spoke aloud. "Help me." Ellie followed her into the woods, her feet moving as if guided by an unseen force. The girl led her to a clearing where a gnarled tree stood, its twisted branches reaching toward the sky like grasping fingers. At its base lay a small pile of stones, arranged in a crude marker. The air was heavy, almost suffocating, and as Ellie knelt by the stones, she could feel Sarah's presence beside her, urging her on. Beneath the stones, Ellie unearthed a rusted locket, its chain broken. Inside was a faded photograph of a man and a little girl. When Ellie returned to the house, her mother was waiting. "Where have you been?" she demanded, but Ellie ignored her, clutching the locket tightly. That night, the house erupted with activity. Doors slammed on their own, footsteps echoed through the hallways, and the air grew icy. Ellie's parents were terrified, but Ellie remained calm. "She's trying to tell us something," Ellie said simply. Her parents stared at her, disbelief etched on their faces. The next day, Ellie took the locket to the local library, where she combed through old records. She discovered that the Crayford house had belonged to the Sinclair family in the early 1900s. Sarah Sinclair, their youngest daughter, had vanished at the age of 10. Her disappearance had never been solved, though whispers of foul play had lingered for decades. Ellie knew she had to help Sarah find peace. That evening, she returned to the barn, shovel in hand. As she dug into the disturbed patch of earth, her heart pounded with both fear and determination. After hours of work, her shovel struck something solid: bones. The police were called, and an investigation confirmed that the remains belonged to Sarah Sinclair. She had been buried there over a century ago, her death covered up by her father, who had been known for his violent temper. The discovery made headlines, and the house seemed to exhale a long-held breath. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, and the whispers ceased. Ellie never saw Sarah again, but she felt her gratitude in the quiet stillness that followed. Her parents, shaken by the events, decided to leave the farmhouse and move back to the city. But Ellie knew that wherever she went, her gift would follow. She had seen beyond the veil, and she knew there were others like Sarah, spirits trapped, waiting for someone who could hear their pleas. Ellie was that someone, and she wasn't afraid. Story the end.
Story number 9.
The Holloway family had no choice but to move into the dilapidated old house on Maple Creek Road. After losing their home to mounting debts, the rent was cheap, and the quiet rural setting seemed like the perfect place for a fresh start. The townspeople, however, avoided the house and rarely spoke of it. For years, rumors had circulated about strange happenings on the property, but the Holloways dismissed the warnings as small-town superstition. 13-year-old Clara Holloway was the first to notice that something wasn't quite right. On their first evening in the house, as her parents unpacked boxes in the kitchen, Clara wandered upstairs. The house was drafty, and the narrow hallway seemed to stretch farther than it should. At the end of it was a small door, slightly ajar, that led to a forgotten storage room. Inside the room, Clara found an old wooden trunk covered in dust. Curiosity got the better of her, and she lifted the lid to find a collection of children's toys, wooden blocks, a worn teddy bear, and a cracked porcelain doll. But at the bottom of the trunk was a strange object, a small music box, intricately carved with swirling patterns. When Clara wound it up, it played a haunting melody that made her skin crawl. She quickly shut it and left the room, feeling as though she was being watched. That night, Clara dreamed of a little girl, about her age, standing in the hallway. The girl wore a tattered dress and had long dark hair that obscured her face. She held the music box in her hands and whispered something Clara couldn't quite hear. The next morning, Clara woke up with the melody still playing in her head. She decided not to tell her parents; they wouldn't understand. Instead, she returned to the storage room to inspect the music box again. As she opened it, the same eerie tune began to play. This time, she noticed faint etchings on the underside of the lid, initials ML and the words "Forever Silent." Over the next few days, strange things began to happen. Clara would hear faint laughter echoing through the house, even when she was alone. Doors opened and closed on their own, and objects moved from one place to another without explanation. At night, her dreams became more vivid. The girl with the music box appeared again, her whispers growing louder. "Help me," the girl finally said in one dream, her voice filled with desperation. Clara began piecing together the fragments of her dreams. She realized the girl must have lived in the house long ago. Her parents still refused to believe anything was wrong, insisting that the creaks and groans of the house were just its old bones settling. One evening, Clara wandered into the backyard where an ancient oak tree stood, its roots snaking deep into the earth. She felt an inexplicable pull toward it. Beneath the tree, she noticed a small patch of earth that looked uneven, as if it had been disturbed. The dream suddenly made sense. This was where the girl wanted Clara to look. With a shovel she found in the shed, Clara began digging. The deeper she went, the colder the air around her became. After what felt like hours, her shovel hit something solid. She unearthed a rusted metal box, its hinges corroded with age. Inside were faded photographs, a torn diary, and a child's locket. The diary belonged to a girl named Margaret Lorne, who had lived in the house nearly a century earlier. The entries were filled with fear and sadness. Margaret wrote of a cruel stepfather who locked her in the attic for days at a time and took away her music box, her only comfort. The final entry ended abruptly, with smudged ink that looked like it had been written in haste. "He's coming. I have to hide." Clara's heart ached as she read Margaret's story. That night, she placed the music box and the locket on her bedside table and whispered into the darkness, "I'll help you, Margaret." The house seemed to come alive after that. Shadows moved where they shouldn't, and the laughter turned to sobbing. Clara's parents, now unable to ignore the disturbances, grew increasingly frightened. But Clara wasn't afraid. She felt connected to Margaret, as if their lives were intertwined. One night, Margaret appeared in Clara's room, not as a ghostly figure, but as a pale, fragile girl. She pointed to the music box and then to the attic. Clara understood. She crept up to the attic, the old stairs creaking under her weight. The room was cold and filled with cobwebs, but Clara felt a strange sense of determination. In the far corner, beneath a pile of rotting blankets, she found it, another patch of disturbed earth. Clara dug with her hands, dirt caking her fingernails until she uncovered a small skeleton. Tears streamed down her face as she realized the truth. Margaret's stepfather had killed her and buried her in the attic, hoping she'd be forgotten. When the remains were reported, the police confirmed the identity using historical records. Margaret's story spread through the town, and the house's dark history finally came to light. The community held a small ceremony for Margaret, burying her properly in the town cemetery. After that, the house grew quiet. The laughter, the sobbing, the whispers, all of it stopped. Clara no longer dreamed of Margaret, but she felt her presence one last time, a warm breeze that brushed against her cheek as she stood beneath the old oak tree. Margaret was finally at peace, and Clara had discovered her own strength. She realized she had a gift, a connection to the spirits of those who had been silenced. And though the thought scared her, it also gave her purpose. Clara knew there were others out there waiting for someone to hear their stories, and she would listen.
Story number 10.
The Whitaker family had been looking for a place to start fresh, and the sprawling 3-story house in the remote town of Windermere seemed like the perfect fit. It was old but charming, with its gabled roof and wraparound porch. The realtor had offered a suspiciously low price, mentioning that the house had been on the market for years. Still, the Whitakers jumped at the chance. For 12-year-old Lily, the house felt like a dream come true. She had always been drawn to old things, antiques, forgotten trinkets, anything with history. From the moment they arrived, Lily couldn't help but explore every corner of their new home. She was particularly fascinated by the attic, where she found boxes of dusty books, a few cobwebbed toys, and a large antique mirror draped with a sheet. When Lily pulled the sheet away, she found the mirror's surface tarnished and foggy, but there was something captivating about it. Its ornate frame was carved with strange symbols and small flowers. It seemed alive somehow, like it was waiting for her. That night, as the rest of her family slept, Lily couldn't shake the feeling that the mirror was calling her. She tiptoed up to the attic, the floorboards creaking beneath her feet, and stood before it. As she stared at her reflection, the faint outline of another figure began to take shape behind her. Lily spun around, but the attic was empty. She looked back at the mirror. The figure was still there, a girl about her age, dressed in an old-fashioned nightgown, her hair hanging in damp strands around her face. Her eyes were wide, filled with fear, and her lips moved soundlessly. Then, as quickly as she had appeared, she was gone. The next morning, Lily tried to tell her parents what she'd seen, but they dismissed it as her imagination. Her father laughed it off, saying, "That's what happens when you stay up too late reading ghost stories." But Lily knew it wasn't her imagination. Over the next few days, she began noticing strange things. Shadows flickered across the walls, even when no one was there. The faint sound of weeping echoed through the house at odd hours, and the attic door seemed to open on its own, always revealing the mirror. The girl appeared again that night. This time, Lily wasn't afraid. She sat cross-legged in front of the mirror and whispered, "Who are you?" The girl didn't answer, but raised a trembling hand and pointed toward the far corner of the attic. Lily turned to look, but saw nothing. When she glanced back at the mirror, the girl was gone. The following day, Lily searched the attic thoroughly. In the corner where the girl had pointed, she found a loose floorboard. Underneath it was a small wooden box, its lid carved with the same strange symbols as the mirror's frame. Inside the box was a diary. Its pages were yellowed and fragile, the handwriting spidery and uneven. It belonged to a girl named Eliza Moreau, who had lived in the house over a century ago. The diary detailed Eliza's lonely life, her strict and cruel father, and her fascination with the strange mirror her father had brought home from an overseas trip. As the entries progressed, they grew darker. Eliza wrote of seeing things in the mirror, shadows, figures, and finally herself trapped within its glass. The last entry chilled Lily to the bone. "Father says I mustn't talk to the mirror anymore. He says it's cursed, but it whispers to me at night, calling me back. I'm afraid I won't be able to resist." That night, the weeping in the house grew louder. Lily could feel the heaviness in the air, as though the house itself was grieving. She returned to the attic with the diary in hand and stood before the mirror. "Eliza," she said softly, "I found your diary. I know what happened to you." The mirror's surface rippled like water, and Eliza appeared again. This time, her expression was one of despair. She pressed her hands against the glass, her mouth forming silent words. "What do you need me to do?" Lily asked. The mirror grew cold, frost forming along its edges. Eliza pointed to the diary, and suddenly, Lily understood. The mirror was a trap, a prison, and Eliza's spirit had been bound to it. The symbols carved into its frame weren't decorative, they were part of a spell. Lily spent hours researching, poring over old books she found in the attic. She pieced together fragments of forgotten lore and realized the only way to free Eliza was to destroy the mirror. But breaking it wouldn't be enough. The ritual required a release of energy, something powerful and pure. The next night, as her family slept, Lily gathered what she needed: candles, salt, and the diary. She set the mirror in the center of the attic and drew a circle around it. Lighting the candles, she began to read aloud from the diary, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. As she read, the house seemed to come alive. The walls groaned, and the air grew icy. The mirror's surface darkened, and Eliza's reflection appeared once more. She looked desperate, her hands pressed flat against the glass. "Hold on, Eliza," Lily whispered. "I'm almost there." The final words of the diary described Eliza's wish to be free, to see the sky again, to feel the sun on her face. As Lily spoke them aloud, the mirror began to crack, fractures spreading across its surface like a spider web. A piercing wail filled the attic, and the candles extinguished themselves. Then, silence. When Lily opened her eyes, the mirror was shattered, its frame empty. The oppressive weight that had hung over the house was gone. For the first time since they'd moved in, the air felt light, as though the house had been cleansed. Lily saw Eliza one last time in a dream. She was standing in a field of wildflowers, her face radiant and free of fear. "Thank you," Eliza said before fading into the light. From that day on, the house was peaceful. The weeping stopped, and the shadows vanished. Lily never told her parents the full story. They wouldn't have believed her anyway. But she kept Eliza's diary, a reminder of the girl who had been trapped and the power Lily had discovered within herself. Lily knew that her connection to the unseen world wasn't an accident. She could feel them now, spirits trapped in darkness, waiting for someone to set them free. And Lily was ready to help. Story the end.